The too long didn't read. We're going to talk a little bit about disruption. We're going to talk a little bit about plant-based meat, and then a little bit about clean meat, which we just saw the video about, meat grown in a laboratory. And I should point out that while plant-based meat is really derived from soy, wheat, mushrooms, and pea proteins, clean meat is still, while it's still in the laboratory phase, could be actually a very significant disruptive force that completely upends the entire food supply as we know it. It is still laboratory stage. It is, if you know the right people, you can probably get a little bit to try. But this is real meat. It is actual muscle, skin, and tissue grown from the stem cells of an animal in a clean environment, so it doesn't have antibiotics, hormones, and fecal contamination. And it basically will actually mimic meat. Still has some challenges, but we'll talk a little bit about that. So we have to address the elephant in the room first, which is the massively well-followed Beyond Meat IPO. So it had an incredible run-up. It was the best performing IPO in the last 20 years, and then an equally spectacular drop. And a little bit of technical analysis kind of reminds me of the boa constrictor that swallowed an elephant from The Little Prince. I would say that this points to both amazing potential, but also real challenges around this industry. So the investing public got very excited about being able to invest in disruption in food. Food has been largely unchanged in 150 years since the industrialization of food. And we're very enamored by the idea of this company and having exposure. It's the only real pure play you can get in terms of investing in food tech. But at some point, the public very quickly realized that there's still some real challenges to this. First of all, you have some very significant incumbents, which are the big meat and food companies, all of whom, after the success of the IPO of Beyond, started to announce that they were launching their own plant-based alternatives or their hybrid alternatives, part meat, part plant. And then the public also started to realize that this isn't like software. So it's not like you can come up with some wonderful code and ship 100 million units tomorrow and get it onto everyone's PC. In fact, there's some real supply chain challenges. There's input challenges, and then there's, of course, distribution and branding challenges. And then there's the fact that in some cases, you don't even really have a lot of IP. So this is more chef work rather than lab work. So there are some real challenges. However, there is definitely money to be made. So if you had been an early investor in Beyond, you would have seen a 400 times return on your money. Even if you had invested at a later private round, you still would have done very well. So this does really get the investor interested and curious. At this point, because Beyond is the only publicly traded name, you are investing, if you're in this space, on the private side. But more than anything, I think this really points to what we're going to see in terms of massive disruption across this space. So we've already seen disruption happen in dairy. Dairy has already fallen 26% over the last 2 decades. Earlier this week, the largest milk company in North America, Tyson Foods, filed for Chapter 11. And a lot of that is really due to the consumer switching their preference from traditional dairy to plant-based. And that's only scratching the surface, because if you think of what's happening inside of meat, it may be an even bigger opportunity. At the very least, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars worth of annual revenue that could be generated out of this very large space. But there are some analysts that predict that this may completely upend food, and that dairy may go completely out of business in the next 15 to 20 years, and that meat as we know it may be completely different. These are some of the estimates that have been out there. So I should say Simon has written a wonderful report, and Jefferies predicts this to be a $240 billion industry by 2040. There are other estimates. A.T. Kearney's in particular has been very aggressive. They believe this is a $370 billion sector. And what they're pointing to is that while consumption of meat overall is going to go up, that traditional meat is going to be displaced by plant-based and clean meat. And for those who maybe think that this is a little bit crazy, right, that meat could actually be upended, sometimes when new technologies come in, I think of the car and its disruptive nature. So this is New York, Fifth Avenue in 1900. And these are all horse-drawn carriages. I don't know if any of you are able to spot the car, but there's the Where's Waldo? And there's the car in 1900. And then just 13 years later, it's impossible to spot the horse. And so what's happening in this food? It's basically, I'd say, 4 factors. It is changes in consumer preferences. It's governments who are increasingly supportive and actually putting in place programs to encourage the reduction of meat consumption in favor of other alternatives. It is price rise, and we're all sitting here in Hong Kong very acute of what's happened in China in terms of meat prices. And prices, as demand for meat consumption globally rises, we can, I think, anticipate that going up even higher. And so that's going to drive additional consumption into protein alternatives, be they plant-based or clean meat. And then over the last 10 years, we've started to see some real innovation in food. Beyond is one example, Impossible Foods is another, which has been very prominent, and the introduction of plant-based milks as well. And then what's coming on the horizon, I think, is really exciting in terms of clean meat. So one of the key drivers, the world's getting richer. 50% of the world in 2018 already hit middle class, and that's in the next 10 years anticipated to be 2/3 of the world. And the middle class wants meat. It is an inordinate amount that's already being produced. We have more than 70 billion livestock that are being grown every single year. And that's going to, and as that meat consumption continues to grow, call it somewhere between 3% to 4% a year, but may even accelerate as the middle class grows, we're stuck with a real problem, which is that we don't have very much land. So only 10% of the world's land is farmable, and we're already using 77% of it to grow animals. So the problem further is that the animal is a very inefficient way of getting protein. So this is a burger. It uses enormous amounts of grain, of energy, of water. And if you look at what can be done with plant-based, it's just a fraction of that. And meat is also a gross polluter. Cows are responsible for, livestock are responsible for somewhere north of 18% of global CO2. And plants don't have that same sort of impact. And so there's the externalities. And then there's what's happening on the government side. So in China, there was always the concern of what would happen if there was a trade war, and it was a very theoretical kind of risk. And so Beijing stockpiled lots of meat in a strategic reserve. But it went under the Trump administration from being theoretical to being actually very real, and coupled with the swine flu, and it's the third major swine-related epidemic in the last 15 years. You've seen massive cullings of the herds, you have a meat shortage, and the prices have gone up by 70%. And that has led the Chinese government to put together the idea of cutting meat consumption in China by 50% over the next 10 years. And they're putting in place programs to make that happen. So there are now government funds and government accelerators that are specifically driving towards the reduction of meat consumption. 39% of Chinese consumers have stated that they want to reduce their meat consumption. Of course, the consumer might state that, but then they still want to have the foods they like. So something needs to step into that gap. And that leads to the rise of the flexitarians. And so this is not just a China trend, this is a global trend. Flexitarians, so people who are eating meat but actively trying to reduce their meat consumption, make up as much as half of the US population, and quite significant. And then that's a trend that we see across many of the developed world, where people are still wanting to have their meat but just have less of it. And that leads to what is a significant market opportunity. So traditional foods, not growing very quickly, just 2% a year, maybe 3% according to some estimates, but plant-based foods in 2018 grew 20% year on year. And so a little bit about plant-based meat. So why is this such a big deal now? There's been plant-based foods for a really long time. China's been developing plant-based meats for, some people say, even more than 1,000 years. And in the US, they've had plant-based alternatives that weren't very sexy for decades. The real difference is that there have been new technologies that have been applied. So traditionally, plant-based meats were just, your boring wheat and soy. And then about 10 years ago, food scientists started trying to think, okay, what else can we do? So they started mixing in potato protein, pea protein. They used new machinery, new extrusion methods, and even to a certain extent using genetic modification to improve the taste of the food. So trying to get really closer to meat analog. So, and the companies that have done this successfully have been very well rewarded. So Beyond, about $5 billion market cap. Impossible. I don't know how many of you guys have tried Impossible, but 94% of the people who try Impossible Foods can't tell the difference between this and an actual beef burger in blind taste tests. So they're getting very, very close. And the reason they're able to do that is there is a genetically modified heme that is plant-based that they were able to develop. So heme is the molecule that is found in blood that gives it that juiciness, the redness, and that sort of nice mouth feel. And the scientists at Impossible were able to replicate that using plants. And so that's led to significant rewards for them, obviously, economically. This is what is also driving on the consumption side. So millennials and Generation Z have been primary drivers. Almost 80% of them are regular consumers of meat alternatives. 30% eat some sort of a meat alternative every week. And as those plant-based alternatives improve, I think we can anticipate to see further increase of the eating of plant-based in someone's plate, I suppose. And then this is what the companies themselves are seeing. So the people who are buying these burgers, they are not vegetarian. 95% of them are people who are buying plant-based meats alongside traditional meat in their grocery basket. So that's what makes this exciting, is that this is the market. It's not those like 6% vegetarian or vegan people in the population. It is everybody else, the other 94%, who are just trying to reduce the amount of meat that they're eating. And this is a few stats. This is why this is sort of exciting. A very large portion are trying to jump on this behavioral trend. And even though plant-based foods are still, with the exception of plant-based milks, still at a very low, still fairly small portion of the food system, the growth rates from these low bases have been pretty staggering. And we are also seeing that happen in restaurants. So really 2019 has been the year where mainstream fast food chains in the United States and globally start to bring in plant-based alternatives. One example is KFC. So your real standard kind of heavy meat kind of a deliverer. They tested out a plant-based chicken without any marketing in one market, and they sold out. And I believe this is St. Louis. They sold out of their entire supply in less than 4 hours. People drove from miles around and lined up around the block just to get a try. And then, of course, there's the success of Impossible landing in Burger King. So this is a deal that I ran the back of the envelope numbers for. If they're actually able to meet their full demand, that should add $191 million of top-line revenue to this company just from one chain. And in the grocery stores, you see that it's a whole suite. So it's a whole variety of meats, everything from sausages to burgers to doner kebabs. You can have pastrami meats that are in a blind taste test would fool you. You have cheeses. You have basically anything you can get from an animal right now. There's somebody out there trying to create or has already created a plant-based version. And so we see one aspect that at Brink we think is very, very interesting is sort of the regionalization of food. So this is an example of one of the companies in the portfolio, Gen Meat, which has minced beef, plant-based minced beef, mooncakes, and a minced pork product focused on the Chinese market. So China, of course, big pork eaters. So it's something like north of 35 kilograms of pork consumed for every man, woman, and child in China. Pork is synonymous with meat. And if you look at the types of products that have come out of Europe and the United States, they really are not focused on the China market. They're trying to disrupt the burger industry. They're trying to do things in dairy. Not as much globally has been done relative to the Chinese market, but you do see locally grown companies that are focusing in on minced pork and local varieties. This is a Hong Kong-based minced pork company. It's done under Green Common. Product is called OmniPork, and it is that minced pork that can be used either in a stir fry or in dumplings, and has that same sort of cooking capability, and made out of pea, wheat, and mushroom. Another company that we invested in at Brink is, again, a plant-based minced pork for the China market, but then also, interestingly, has a second line that they are launching, which is halal meats for the Gulf nations. So the Gulf nations have a very serious problem. The meats have to be halal, which means traditionally getting live animal transport from New Zealand and Australia and elsewhere, and that's a very difficult process. A lot of the animals die along the way, and there's all kinds of complexities around that. A better way to do it is to have a plant-based alternative, make it in a halal factory in Malaysia, and then ship that worldwide. So these products are not simply trying to be as good as meat, but actually trying to solve some very significant problems. And here's an interesting one out of Israel, which is the 3D printing of meat. So, one of the nice things about meat is it has that sort of stringiness, the mouthfeel. A steak isn't just about purely the taste, but also the feel. These guys have found a way to 3D print meat. So there's some pretty cool edge cases. And now cellular agriculture or clean meat, which is what I think is something really exciting. So basically, what is it? You extract stem cells from an animal. You separate them out into their various components. You put them into a bioreactor, which is basically a washing machine for cells. So it has a little mechanism that keeps the liquids all in a flow. You put the stem cells into this nutritional broth, this growth medium, and you basically fool the cells into thinking they're still inside of an animal so that they will propagate. And then you would then try to work those cells into a scaffolding and try to replicate meat. And again, this is real meat. This is not derived from a plant. So you can imagine trying to get the world's best steak by taking stem cells from a Kobe beef cow or the world's best pig and having a cut of the world's that comes directly from the finest animal in the world. And so these are the components. It is a stem cell growth medium, a bioreactor scaffolding, and the meat. Each one of these has their own challenges. Right now, the biggest challenges are in the price of the growth medium, which is somewhere north of $900 a liter, which means that if you were to actually try to get a petri dish worth of meat, you're still talking about thousands of dollars, so no consumers willing to pay that. But if you think that just a few years ago, this was hundreds of thousands of dollars for a small burger, if you follow those cost curves down, we could be seeing within the next few years a burger that you can have which is at the same cost or maybe even less than you're currently paying for a traditional burger and doesn't have the hormones, the antibiotics, and all the other contaminants. And so these are sort of the main hurdles. Cost is obviously the biggest one. Government regulations, there's no structure for how to deal with these products. One company called Just out of San Francisco was trying to launch chicken nuggets in the Asian market for the last year and a half, and they're running into regulatory hurdles. And then, of course, there's the challenges around infrastructure. So we don't have massive bioreactors for creation of meat. But these are all things that can be addressed. And on the infrastructure side, it's a potential investment opportunity. On the growth medium side, this is probably the single biggest bottleneck. It's all made to pharmaceutical grades. It's very expensive. Someone's got to come out there and invent a way of driving that cost down and making food-grade growth media. And it's also not universal. So different media can have better results with different cells. And that also, and another aspect is as new media are being tried and people are using chemical media, there's toxicity issues. So media is the biggest issue. And then the other is trying to figure out, which cells will grow best. So when thinking about which clean meat products one might want to invest in, there's basically several vectors that I would use. I'd consider three things. So one is it a type of meat that is very expensive traditionally? So foie gras is sort of the perfect clean meat, right? Because it costs just so much per unit. Number two, is it a simple and rapidly growing cell structure? So again, the liver cells are very straightforward. Just said that they had very good luck growing duck and chicken particularly. Other animals may be more difficult, but there are companies, basically anything you can think of on the meat side, there's somebody now trying to grow that from stem cells. That's chicken, beef, pork, etc. And one out of Singapore called the Siak meat, which is growing lobster and crab and has been massively oversubscribed even as a first round of funding. And then there's also a problem on the texture. So scaffolding is still an issue. So the products that a lot of these clean meat companies are launching first are chicken nuggets, they are pâtés, they are faux bois kind of things, because you don't need to have structure. So structure hasn't yet been worked out. And then there's the challenge around the reusability of stem cells. And so one example here from Hong Kong is Avant, which is a company that is doing fish maw. And again, this sort of meets those three vectors that make it work. So fish maw, traditionally, very, very expensive, hard to extract from the fish. And so there's already a consumer willingness to pay. So for them, trying to drive the price point down, it doesn't need to go nearly as far down. And the other is that because it is a fairly simple cell end product, it grows very, very quickly. They also, as a fish, because it's a cold-blooded animal, the conditions inside of a bioreactor aren't nearly as stringent. So it's easier, again, to grow. And so they've had some very good success. These items were demoed just a month ago here in Hong Kong. There's salmon from a company in the United States called Wild Type. There is a company out of Israel doing steak with texture and structure called Aleph Farms. And then with that, I think I should, since it's an investor conference, we should talk about the dollars and cents and try to figure out where there's opportunities in all of this. So important to point out, it's not just sort of forward crazy VC type people that are investing in this space. The incumbents have climbed aboard this bandwagon. So the traditional meat companies have been significant investors in this space. Tyson Foods is one that has been very aggressive in terms of investing in both plant-based and cellular and clean meat. The CEO of Tyson has come out and said that he wants the company to be seen as a protein company, not as a meat company, and that if they could get meat without the cow, for sure they would try to do it. Because companies like Tyson, which is one of America's biggest meat companies, is fully aware of the challenges of growing animals to try to get protein, right? They're expensive to grow, it's dangerous for the workers, you have to continuously give it more antibiotics and hormones, and they can't really get additional growing efficiencies. And as you have all those new middle class, global middle class folks trying to get meat, a company like Tyson knows that they have to come up with other solutions. So they've been investing in future meat out of Israel, in Memphis meat, which is out of the United States. Cargill is on this bandwagon. And that's something to consider if you are looking at investing within the space, is that the incumbents have a very significant role. Now, on the positive side, the M&A environment and the exit environment for early stage investment has been very solid. You've had some very significant M&As. The big incumbent companies have been more than willing to pay up because they're seeing that their future could be very significantly disrupted. So they're investing in their own disruptors, and they're trying to add additional products onto their product line. I think you'll see that eventually a lot of these incumbents will end up launching hybrid products. So Tyson has already announced a hybrid where it's going to be some percentage ground beef, some percentage plant-based. And then in terms of investment, you've had some significant investment on the plant-based side. Plant-based meat has been really an investable area for almost 10 years now. Beyond was incorporated a decade ago. Impossible has also been incorporated around that same time. They've only just now gotten their products to market within the last couple of years, but this space has been one that investment has been in for some time. And you can really see that last year was very healthy from an investment standpoint. Clean meat is still much newer. So this is still all laboratory stage stuff. The companies are keeping their IP and secret sauce pretty close to the breast. And it's hard to tell who the winner is going to be. Because unlike plant-based meat, where you're really taking a bet on some good branding and distribution capabilities of the teams, when it comes to clean meat, you're really betting on the science. And one or two or maybe a handful of companies might end up becoming the category killers if they're able to sort of solve all the riddles. So so also very interesting area, but much newer from an investment area. And then in terms of what this means from an investment standpoint relative to other sectors, we're still just really at the beginning, right? So other things like cannabis or ag tech, is completely dwarfing what's happening in plant-based meat and cellular agriculture. And these are a few areas that we think are particularly interesting to invest in. So we really like the meat and seafood sort of, center of the plate kind of replacements. So thinking really more about penicillin rather than vitamins, the must-have rather than the nice-to-have. So we tend to steer ourselves a little bit away from things like condiments and really focus in on those big things that are going to move the needle for consumers. And on the clean meat and cellular agriculture side, there's a couple of companies inside of our portfolio now that we're particularly excited about. And this is sort of the red ocean, blue ocean kind of way of thinking of the world. So I would say that things like dairy replacements, especially in just milk, is already been largely done. Burgers, you're entering already into a very competitive space. Things like sausages and so on, more or less done. But there's other areas that haven't been touched. Things that have that no one has sort of emerged as the winner, and then of course the regional aspects of it. So the way that China eats food is completely different than how Latin America eats and Europe, and trying to have winners emerge within those markets who not only understand how the local consumer eats food, but also is able to strike the right branding tone and get the right kind of distribution is the kind of things that we look for. And these are some of the little touch points. Basically, same thing as you would look for in any venture. You're looking for a technology moat. You're looking for a team that can really execute on the branding and distribution side. And you're looking for products that are solving some very significant problems. And that's, I think, a pretty decent overview of this. So I would love to be able to answer any questions if you have any.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Thanks.